Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching this from. I know people are tuning in from all around the world. Either way, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Paddy, I'm Executive Creative Director and Partner at Born, and I'm absolutely chuffed to be hosting the next 45 minutes where we're going to explore the style by social topic and take a bit of a deep dive into how we're seeing Gen Z shaping this new social first aesthetic that's super prominent across social at the moment. So for those of you who've just joined us who may or may not know who we are Born Social. We are a global social specialist agency, and we exist to harness the chaos of social and to do that for the brands of tomorrow. And this notion of harnessing the chaos feels incredibly apt for the subject today, because I think new emerging trends, especially any ones involving Gen Z, directly contribute to that feeling or perception of chaos on social. You know, they seemingly crop up out of nowhere. They're often nonsensical, a riddle of inside jokes or references that, regardless of who you are, can make you feel on the fringes of social in a matter of minutes. And if you're a brand that's existed for longer than 24 months, that minefield can feel even more intimidating to navigate. And selfishly, from our perspective as well, this is something we've found really interesting to observe over the last year or so. So we thought it'd be a good excuse to get under the skin of this topic a bit more. And the good news is we have some of the best social creative minds in the business to help us do just that this morning. So we've got Joe Jordan, immensely talented creative strategist who is also a big fan of surrealist and absurd Gen Z humor now. So that's also really helpful. And then we've got Mary Kincott, who is a true creative powerhouse. And you'll all be very excited to hear that Mary is in fact Gen Z herself, which is good news. It's not just going to be 45 minutes of millennial speculation. We actually have someone who's on the inside, which is always great to hear. That's enough of intros. We'll get started on the topic. So style by social, why have we called it this, apart from loving alliteration? What is this? Why are we talking about this now? Why does it feel relevant? I think at Born, especially in the creative team, we have seen a real influx of these Gen Z-centric brands across social and observed some really interesting kind of behaviors and strategies that are being coined by them. And it feels really clear now that they're starting to rewrite the rules of social first creative is. And we were really keen to understand more and share some thoughts on that. So I think one caveat worth mentioning is that anytime you speak on behalf of an entire generation, especially one that houses both Prince George and the rapper Little Pimp, you make some generalizations. But broadly, I think the kind of trends and the patterns in here do a good job of representing a new wave of consumer. So in a nutshell, this is how we're going to break out the think here over the next 45 minutes. I'm going to kick you off by looking at what people are saying, what's happening, what exactly is kind of going on, and why we think that is showing up in the way it is. And then I'm going to hand over to the brilliant Joe and Mary, who are going to step in and take you through some of the brands that are smashing it out of the park on a daily basis, really setting the bar for what this looks like. And because this is a creative talk, there's not a graph or chart in sight, which is exactly what we like to hear. And hopefully this gives you plenty of fuel for the future. And finally, don't worry if you have to drop off, a minute or two early. We're going to be sending around the slides, so everyone has access to all the references and all the stuff you'll see this morning. You can have that in your own time. So I'll kick us off. I'm going to spend that first 10, 15 minutes sort of setting the scene slightly, looking at actually what is going on and where this all's coming from. I think when you get under the skin of the subject, what's interesting to see is that a lot of people are attributing the rise of this new wave of brands to two common themes. So firstly, a general backlash to the recent dominance of very millennial focused, very slick D2C brands that are creating a bit of a kind of bland homogeny. And then secondly, kind of this ever increasing creative confidence and therefore, of course, influence that Gen Z have, specifically, their behaviors, their trends, their preferences, and how they're now driving change at a business level. So I'll start with the first point on branding backlash. And this is a term that's been affectionately coined by Ben Schott, who's a really brilliant design journalist who's explored this subject and many surrounding it for his writing across Bloomberg, which I highly recommend digging out after this. It's super, super interesting. And he broadly believes that the branding backlash is based on the general fatigue that's surrounding the recent dominance of these kind of slick, minimalist, challenger style brands. And I think we've all seen the last 10 years, we've all been part of this explosion of these direct consumer startups, which by now I'm sure you can't even really imagine your life without, which is slightly strange to conceive. And these are the businesses that showed up to flip that established category or product on its head, offer you a much clearer, much more considered solution to a problem you probably didn't even know you really had. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call who subscribes or purchases at least 3 to 4 of these. So much so that you probably recognize them in your lives, in your house. If you walk into your bathroom, potentially your face cream or skincare looks a little something like this. Potentially your toothbrush might look something like this. Your paint might look something like this. And if you are top tier, your toilet roll might even look something like this. And it's these brands, the Harrys, the Aways, the Caspers of the world that have really dominated brand design in the recent years. And social has played a huge role in accelerating that success. And I personally think the label of bland or blanding feels a little too harsh. Not just because I base about 30% of my personality off these brands, but because generally they are pretty gorgeous and really successful brands. But really, we're not looking at the specific aesthetic. It's more the general homogeneity, the kind of lack of definition and difference between them, and that creating this kind of sea of similarity that then creates a sense of blandness. And it's not just in necessarily how they look, but how they show up, how they speak, how they advertise and talk about themselves. And ironically, it feels like there's a decreasing reluctance to disrupt that aesthetic that now feels so ingrained. And that homogeneity, that kind of rush to the safe middle ground, feels like it's no better illustrated in what the well-documented sort of modernization of established brands across the world in multiple sectors. That minimalist, modern look that now feels quite unoriginal when you see it like this. A bland approach to branding, which has created no real clear point of difference. I think interestingly, you can see that trend mirrored in the evolution of social platforms too, and the behaviors and the functionalities within them. As that era of sort of social 2.0 was ushered in well over a decade now, those primitive early information sharing platforms, forums and journals, they gave way to the new established media sharing platforms, the rise of the MySpaces. Here's Tom from MySpace, the Facebook and Instagram that have made it through the last few years. And that shift, I think, meant that your social presence was more public, it was more permanent, and therefore, of course, as you expect, more curated than ever. It gave way to that feeling that I think we've all been part of, that you need to show the most perfect, the most considered and curated version of yourself at all times. It has to be a portfolio of your life, driven potentially more by aesthetic than value, and that feeling of having to #do things for the gram. I think it's really well illustrated in this shot from one of my favorite Instagram account, Boyfriends of Insta. These 3 people all on the same beach, but consciously cropping the reality around them to create a version that suits themselves, that is good looking on the surface, but frankly unoriginal and inauthentic in the grand scheme or the surroundings. And I think we all feel like we are part of this new, interesting era of social, one that is, actually elevating people from these curators into proper creators, social first creators. It's a social that is much more diverse, much more disparate, more layered, more complex, and of course, more integrated than ever. And it's that sort of new era that is pushing us as individuals and users, but also the brands as well, from this consciously curated mindset into the new creative chaos, let's call it. And that era, we know, is being heavily driven by Gen Z, their beliefs, their behaviors, and kind of the inherent confidence they have within the platforms. And really, it's no wonder it's being driven by them. We merely adopted social. They actually properly grew up in it. And because of this, they are ready and waiting to write and then rewrite the rules of emerging platforms or trends, and therefore dictate how brands are going to use them. And it goes without saying, Gen Z are hot property, hence why we're here this morning. Everyone wants to understand how to speak to them, to garner that attention and that love from them. Partly, yes, because obviously as they mature and as they grow up, they command an ever-increasing financial influence. So therefore, their ability to immediately impact the bottom line of your business is more important. But really, it's their influence on brands and the behaviors that I think are truly valuable. And ironically, for a generation that believes quite heavily in dismantling labels, they've been given quite a few because we work in advertising. We need to brand everything. So for this, we'll steal the label of Generation Create. It was coined by Adobe a couple of years ago, which I feel like is exactly the sort of thing that someone who's actually Gen Z would shudder, but alas, we go on. And it's not that they, as a generation or group of people, are born with more creativity in their DNA. It's really that they are just more adept at understanding and applying those trends. They're more open to that self-expression and just generally less risk averse. And again, it's potentially a generalization, but I think one notion that seemingly does well to characterize this generation when looking into it is this idea of generally refusing to color within the lines, to take anything regardless at face value, to assume that anything is binary just because that's the way it's been done. before. And this is super apparent across social. You know, when a new platform or update emerges, that generation make it work for them and their needs as opposed to that of the platform itself. And it is that constant experimentation I think is breeding the originality and creativity. And a really good example of this concept of kind of refusing to color within the lines is how Gen Z interpret the social first language of emojis, which I think I assumed, and I imagine everyone on this call assumed, was relatively binary, right? Like a smile means a smile, but nope, how wrong we were. Actually, if you scratch beneath the surface, there is this kind of sub-narrative that's being driven by Gen Z, you know, one where a skull means a laugh and a smile, I mean, of course, is ironic. And, you know, God forbid you use the crying, laughing emoji and expose yourself to the boomer that you really are. I think it's this rule-breaking mentality that's spawned some of the most interesting, the most original, the most entertaining parts of social. You know, it's created a world that brings together the two core traits of Gen Z culture. You've got that dorkily awkward, unfiltered, funny, surreal part of social, with the adorably real, de-glamorized, spontaneous, raw part as well. And this is the world that, you know, simply does reject that slick, considered, curated, minimalist approach to brands, and instead massively opts to embrace the awkward, embarrassingly honest, and rough around the edges brand. And this world has now, of course, bred a new type of brand, born out of social, directly in response to the trends, the beliefs, behaviors that have been harbored and created within it. And those are the brands that are this combination of dorkily awkward, adorably real, and therefore they are this adorkable, as they've been coined and called by quite a few people. In the same way, I think the slick millennial brands, those D2C brands that we all know and love, were designed to connect directly with millennials. Adorkable brands, they really exist to connect solely with Gen Z and make a number of conscious decisions to do just that. So that is a whistle-stop tour of introducing you to this concept of adorkable brands. But now we want to take a bit of a deeper dive into exactly how they are being styled by social and what are these identifying attributes that they often use. So to do this, we're going to look at two core themes that I think are influencing this the most. So first, we're going to look at self-deprecation, and then we're going to look at self-expression, and actually touch on, I think, how they closely reflect Gen Z's general conflict between this idea of self-consciousness, but also self-promotion, like the intersection between vulnerability and authenticity that feels really prevalent. So we'll kick off with self-deprecation, arguably the most interesting, most obvious of the two. There are lots of other buzzwords that kind of fall neatly under this bracket, you know, nihilism, absurdism, insecurity, irony. They're all really relevant, and they're all words that are often associated with Gen Z and specifically their approach to humor. But I think what's really interesting, the interesting part is that the commitment of adorkable brands, the commitment they have to relinquishing control, to really feeling confident to step away from self-validation. Adorkable brands seem to genuinely be capable of putting themselves at the butt of the joke, which I think is something that millennial brands just still don't feel confident to do. Instead, always opting for, favouring things that seem to be favourable and, you know, favourable for their reputation. And the reason why this is so prevalent in adorkable brands is because it's just so prevalent in Gen Z culture. You know, self-deprecation, satire, irony is arguably the most powerful tool that they have dealing with an incredibly turbulent reality, you know, one that is fraught with anxiety, debt, inequality, climate crisis, FOMO, and just a general sense of impending doom. And when you're raised on the internet, which I think we all know can be a pretty weird place sometimes, that self-deprecation and dark humor is ingrained within you, because if you don't laugh, there's a chance you'll cry. And I think what's really interesting is that self-deprecation is a brilliant vehicle to achieve something that seemingly a lot of Gen Z have in common, which is that want to use the internet to make the world a better place, but also to use it to mock the things that are trying to destroy them. And that is the genius, I think, of adorkable brands. They manage to blur these lines. You know, they bring these two opposing needs together. Whereas, you know, historically, you might think you need to commit to one. Adorkable brands don't see them as mutually exclusive. They use self-deprecation, satire, brutal honesty, and they use that to do business with in a way that appeals to a generation to have that razor-sharp bullshit detector. I think after all, you know, insecurity is relatable. Like, no one likes the idea of pretending that everyone is fine all the time. Like, a lot of things are shit, and owning it is quite appealing. And you see this in Gen Z behavior as well. You know, studies showing that Tinder dating profiles across that generation have shown a 30% increase in the word anxiety, which is something you might have previously avoided, but actually that creates, you know, shows vulnerability, creates warmth and affection for it. And you see self-deprecation and satire all over social. You know, no more on accounts like this. This is called Affirmations. It's run by a Norwegian artist called Mats Andersen. It is a truly surreal and psychedelic trip into self-deprecation, irony, and satire. He purposely subverts these kind of cliche self-troll stereotypes we've seen, across the likes of Pinterest for years, but he works them back in a way that speaks directly to Gen Z. And that's like trying to seek that positivity, create community and bond around this idea of self-doubt infused with really heavy doses of satire and irony. And of course, then that mentality has made its way into brands. Brands like Nugs, which Joe will dive into later, they lean into that self-deprecating tone of voice, and they do that to kind of, I suppose, address the elephant in the room. Generally use it to reject the banality of how brands have talked about their purpose or their product in years to date, and instead aimed at just garnering that love and that fame through the humor and their commitment to transparency. And then you've got brands like Everyday Humans, right, who proudly boast their anti-average sun care, and then playfully name products like Resting Beach Face and Rosé S'il vous plaît, which is just like really fun. It's that kind of brash honesty, the confidence to play in that space that feels interesting and ownable. But also this notion of self-deprecation isn't just confined to tone of voice as well. Cosmetic brands like Fluff, they embody this in their imagery and their approach to art direction. They've got these images that feel unfinished, unflattering potentially, even sometimes outright unappealing. You've got a product shot there next to like a half-drunk drink or a slush puppy. And actually that just speaks to their kind of commitment to reality, their confidence as a brand to dismantle what's expected of them. And actually, I suppose, reflects this broader teenage angst, that trying hard isn't cool, and they do that really well. And in design as well, you see that idea of self-deprecation showing up too, I think, namely in combinations on the surface feel like they shouldn't really work. So take Behave Candy here. They've got this color palette that's super bright, really high impact. Clashing neons feels a bit erratic at first sight, almost like purposefully bad. And I think that's kind of the point. It's like the self-deprecation is showing up in their way to poke fun or reject what would be traditional standards, and instead embrace that strained and absurd. And then this sort of maximalism, retro style maximalism approach is so prevalent just generally across adorkable brands. So this is a fashion brand called Camp High, which is co-founded by Supreme. And frankly, it kind of feels like one big joke. Like you can't tell if they're laughing at you or with you. And so when you arrive at the website, which is here, you'd be forgiven for thinking you clicked kind of a dodgy ad banner back in 2002, but you quickly kind of realize it is all intentional. And then the clothes themselves are purposefully so jarring, and they almost look like they've been created in word art. The style just reeks of self-deprecation and satire, even how they describe cozy, which is their space, as a lifestyle choice, not a hobby. And just in case you're wondering, by the way, that hoodie on the right is $210. So just take that away as well. So that is quick stop on self-deprecation, but I also wanted to touch on self-expression and how that I feel like is another key driver for these adorkable brands. And really self-expression here is speaking to the confidence, the self-assuredness, the want to promote that feels like it's ingrained in how Gen Z use social and the social first culture, but also I think more broadly just positivity, like sheer joy surrounding everything, the want to do and have fun whilst you can. And we see lots and lots of brands embracing self-expression for quite a while. It's nothing new. Lots of established brands, established millennial brands like ASOS, actually back in 2018 founded a new sub-brand called Collusion, which was, as they define it, this fashion for the coming of age, which was that audience who really, they believe, demand something different, and have different views on what fashion industry is. And what's interesting is it's entirely designed by Gen Z, for Gen Z. And when they actually announced it and launched it, they used 100 young people from around Britain who just turned 18, and they gave them their platform to express their individuality. And I think it's all of that is anchored in those ideas of collaboration, of inclusivity, experimentation, and doing that to try and speak to a new generation of shopper. And I think fashion, we know, is a real hotbed for self-expression. And you can see this reflected in fashion trends that center themselves around, more heavily specifically around enthusiasm and optimism. And there's this emerging trend that I think started about a year ago that embodies this notion, and it's a nickname because of that, dopamine dressing. And it's fashion, but sort of not so much as we know it. Really the core emphasis is around the bright colors, the optimism of the prints, and actually centered more heavily around reducing barriers to enjoying fashion and instead promoting creativity and self-expression. So again, heavily triggered by Gen Z, facilitated by social, it feels really powerful, expressive, but above all, the key thing is uplifting. And I think that's kind of the point here, is it's kind of designed to counter the conformity. So instead, not focusing directly on how fashion makes you look, but how it makes you feel. And I think that's a great example of self-expression and positivity, taking that spotlight away from aesthetic alone. And then, of course, brands lean into this heavily. They mirror that confidence, that self-belief, that positivity. They play that role of almost digital cheerleader. So you've got brands here like Cute, which is spelled K-Y-O-O-T, which could be the most Gen Z spelling of all time. It's a vegan chocolate brand. It beams out these messages of support, of self-expression out all day, and they bring through some of the retro Y2K dreamlike aesthetic that we know is really, really loved by Gen Z, and they use that to help bolster and act as a catalyst for self-expression. So when we come back to the question of kind of what exactly is it, I think the most articulate description that we've seen is that it's this broadly a kind of a vandalism of visual conformity. So not so much a conscious choice, more a rejection or opposite of what's been done before, and actually focusing on creating a presence that aims to break, dismantle, go against aesthetic codes that have been set up by millennials or just previously in general. And arguably, I think the most interesting thing about all of this is how you see this pattern in history. So Gen Z are often compared to the lost generation who grew up just post World War I. That's the generation that birthed the Dada movement, that was obviously designed to reject reality and to do it with whimsy and with nonsense. And I think that's almost exactly what we're kind of seeing with Gen Z on social, that absurdity and existentialism just breeding a whole new type of creativity. So that is a look at what we're seeing, what's going on. We're now going to jump into some more of those in-depth examples and some more of those brand case studies, the ones that are doing it on a daily basis, who are smashing it out of the park. And I'm going to hand over to Joe and Mary and talk you through those now.
Thanks, Paddy. Right, so I'm going to deep dive into the wonderfully weird world of Simulate, a chicken nugget simulation. Next slide, please. For those of you who aren't aware, Simulate, or Nugs, as they were previously known before a rebrand this year, are a plant-based chicken nugget alternative. They've got less fat and more protein than the animal-based alternative. They're 100% cholesterol-free, and they're plant-based, made in a plant. And the brand themselves don't hide the fact that they're cooked up in a lab. And unlike other companies that keep most of their development behind closed doors, Simulate founder Ben Pasternak wants his company to operate from a place of truth. And the company backs this up by openly showing the changes that Simulate's recipe has gone through on its website. So each version of Nugs comes with its own release notes, similar to a software update. So phrases such as Nugs 2.0 include fixes and improvements, including improved chicken taste. Simulate have even gone so far as to call themselves the Tesla of chicken. That's quite the statement for a frozen nugget brand. However, this wit and transparency isn't lost on Gen Z, who have instantly taken the brand to their hearts. And during a pandemic, a time when people relied more than ever on frozen produce, Simulate saw a huge growth thanks to their refreshingly honest outlook, especially on social media. So I'm going to take you through 3 factors that contribute to Simulate's success on social and why they are winning with Gen Z. And that can be boiled down to 3 things. As Paddy's already touched upon, they have a great self-deprecating tone of voice. Secondly, it's doing things for the sake of fun. And thirdly, they found a way to organize the chaos of social. But firstly, I'm going to talk about that self-deprecating tone of voice. And so they might be plant-based, but Simulate are under no illusions that they're the healthy alternative. The brand themselves having pushed messages such as kills you slower to consumers back when they launched in 2018. Nugs may be better for you than a classic chicken nugget, but the brand has deliberately avoided pushing a vegan agenda and have instead opted for a more self-deprecating attitude that, as Paddy has mentioned in detail, goes down extremely well with a Gen Z audience. An outlook that also aligns with their kind of startup image and differentiates them from other plant-based meat alternatives such as Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. Simulate's Instagram, for example, is almost entirely meme-based with product announcements kind of interspersed sparingly. The brand is firmly embedded in internet culture and quick to react and align itself with the latest trends, often at their own expense. And on screen, you can see a few examples from their Instagram of that self-deprecating tone of voice in action. And from the insane levels of interaction you can see on their posts, it's clear to see that they've tapped into a highly engaged audience, an audience that definitely sees themselves in the posts. Often you see comments under their posts such as, I love this account. Please know you're doing your job perfectly. Damn, I've got to turn my notifications on for this. Came in for the nugs, stayed for the content, and you need a raise. So as you can see, they're almost calling out the admin directly and showing their support and appreciation for what they're doing and almost the entertainment that they're providing. Most brands would absolutely kill for this type of affection, but Simulate seem to generate it almost effortlessly, simply by poking fun at themselves. The second thing we're going to talk about is doing things for the sake of fun. Now, from what you've already seen, Simulate's social presence is kind of lo-fi, it's meme heavy, it's not particularly polished for such a high-tech product packed with plant-based innovation. Not what you'd expect from the Tesla of chicken. However, Simulate do invest some time and money in elements of their content, but not in the areas that you might expect. And that is precisely why they do it. So a quick scroll through the brand's Instagram, and you'll see a number of nug hacks, well-produced, highly polished CGI videos suggesting ways in which people can incorporate nugs into meals beyond the expected, beyond dipping it in ketchup or whatever. Each video starts with the message "run code," as you can see on screen, again, aligning with that high-tech simulated identity. And to be honest, the recipe suggestions are quite frankly ridiculous. You've got nug kebabs, nug waffles with maple syrup, and perhaps most bizarrely, you've got spaghetti and nugs with a rich tomato sauce. There's no way any sane person would bother whipping up any of these recipes. And as I've mentioned, that's exactly the point. They ironically ironically invest in this type of content because they think it's funny, not because they think their followers will find it useful at all. They're after a laugh rather than appreciation. And these hacks are a deliciously ridiculous way of achieving that goal. And finally, we're going to talk about how Simulate harness the chaos of social. At Born, we talk about harnessing the chaos as something that brands of today need to do to succeed. And Simulate have found a way to organize the chaos by handing the keys to their brand over to the people who get their audience better than anyone else. And that is Gen Z. And nowhere is that more evident than on their TikTok account. Any brand hoping to make an impact with Gen Z needs to have a presence on TikTok. And Simulate's tactic has been to make one Gen Zer the face of their brand on the platform. So this is the very youthful, very visible face of Simulate on TikTok. I couldn't find her name anywhere, so let's just call her Nugs Girl for this presentation. It's a term that she also calls herself in the content that she creates. And so Nugs Girl appears to have free reign to insert nugs in cultural conversations that she deems appropriate, often joking that her boss locks her in the basement or takes credit for her success online without really understanding what she's doing. Once again, another example of that self-deprecating Gen Z humor. And of course, she would have been briefed on certain topics to steer clear of, but she has the freedom to jump on trends with the weight of a brand behind her. And that is incredibly refreshing. Her boss may not know what she's up to in that basement, but it does reflect incredibly positively on the brand. They're willing to trust her decisions, allowing her to organize that chaos, knowing full well that she is the best woman for the job. And talking about the best women for the job, I'm going to hand you over to Mary now, who's going to run you through another absolutely killer Gen Z case study.
That was such a smooth transition. And I never thought I'd want nugs at 10 a.m, but I guess there's a first time for everything. So yeah, my name's Mary, and when I was thinking about what brand to cover, the first thing that came to mind was Estrid, and it might be because they rather aggressively targeted me on Instagram until I inevitably caved and bought their product. But I do think there are huge factors as to why Estrid is the brand for Gen Z. Particularly their iconic Y2K aesthetic that just spoke to my inner Gen Z, So in short, if you haven't heard of Estrid before, it's a brand that's reinventing shaving for women. So in the past, I think you can narrow it down to two kinds of razors. that women would buy into. Firstly, we have the mass-produced old school razors targeted to women, usually pink. Not great for the environment, lacks quality, and plagued with pink tax, a term that's used to describe an added cost to items that are marketed to women. And I think both of those things conflict with Gen Z values. And then secondly, if you're wanting a little bit more of a clean shave, women will opt in for the male alternative razors that are usually marketed towards men. They'll give you a clean shave for sure, they're reusable, great, but it lacks a female voice. And as humans, we look to brands to hold the same values as we do, and almost a platform for self-expression. Enter Estrid, a subscription-based shaving company that's affordable, convenient, inclusive, charitable, vegan, all of the above being incredibly attractive to a Gen Z audience. And that is Estrid. So visually speaking, Estrid embodies so much of what we've already spoken about previously. So self-expression, dopamine dressing, avant basic, but more specifically, I'm going to be covering these 3 reasons that I think Estrid are the embodiment of this new era of Gen Z driven social. First up, we have breaking social conventions. So on to the next slide, that would be grand. Breaking social conventions. This is by no means a safe strategy for a brand. And I suppose that's the point. Estrid is a brand that actively tries to break social conventions around shaving and promotes things like body positivity, something that hasn't been all too common in the beauty industry until recently. And Gen Z is a generation, I believe, see right through unrealistic beauty standards set by brands. And Estrid here are taking advantage of this. Instead, they're a brand that champion diversity, representation, and like to do things a little bit differently, as you can see here. So Estrid have made a conscious decision to recruit talent that is representative of the people actually using their product, and aren't afraid to show off stuff like body hair, stretch marks, a diverse range of models or influencers that they're working with. And I like this. It's a vegan product. Need I say more? And leading on to my second point, anti-perfection. Estrid speak to Gen Z's desire for anti-perfection. It's a bit of a revolution, really, as the brand covers anti-perfection in 2 key ways. Firstly, I think aesthetically, you can see there's something a little bit different about this brand as opposed to shaving brands that have come before. There's this resurgence of Y2K, which is an aesthetic that was prevalent in popular culture from roughly 1995 to 2004. So think Backstreet Boys, The Hills, Paris Hilton. There's like this pink tint to everything, and a lot of minimalism contrasted with these bright neon colors. It's also incredibly lo-fi for content that you'd usually associate with a shaving brand. It feels fresh and creative, dreamy, and it would appeal to this generation create through grainy shots that you could imagine being taken on your iPhone, and they probably are. And most likely these shots would be rejected from another campaign in another situation for another brand. Also, we have notes of social first content. So on the example to the left, you can see that they're using in-app font from TikTok, as well as a filter that you can probably get from TikTok as well. And this is a paid media ad. This isn't just sitting organically on the feed, and it's working for them. At least I bought into it. So aesthetically, we can see the Gen Z inspired anti-perfection in Estrid. However, their attitude reflects this adversity to perfection too. They're speaking to an audience that care about aesthetic for sure, through creativity, but it's not about painting this perfect picture and creating unrealistic beauty standards. And they don't suggest to their potential customers that they should be perfect and you should shave. Instead, they're promoting stuff like self-love, adopting the line, shaving is optional, great shaving shouldn't be. Not forcing beauty ideals to potential new customers, but instilling this positive ethos associated with the brand. In other words, they're a fan of keeping it real. So to engage with an audience that are self-deprecating and transparent, they do exactly that. They're not afraid to laugh at themselves and take the mick out of, to be the butt of their own joke. As you can see in the bottom left example, they've screenshotted a tweet that says, Estrid, you can stop the targeted advertising now. I bought the damn razor. I relate. With the caption that says, was it smooth enough though? It's not selling anything, but they're creating this, they're creating their own subculture and an inside joke for their community to be a part of. And it really works. Like, as you can see from the engagement on these posts, people are laughing with them and not at them. And this is something that brands in the past would have steered away from. Like, you don't want the negative association with your brand, but here instead Estrid are taking something and using it as a positive, somehow flipping the negativity of over advertising into something that's quite funny. So through the tone of voice and the outright randomness of the content that they're posting, like, look at this little hedgehog, how is that selling a razor? They're creating their own little world for people to be a part of and fall in love with. So that's why I think Estrid is a brand that I believe are one of are truly harnessing the chaos of Gen Z's influence on social, through aesthetic, to breaking conventions, adopting an anti-perfection approach in their attitude, and just keeping it real. And I think it's refreshing, and it's truly one of the most inspiring brands on social for me at the moment.
Amazing. Thank you so much both. That was wicked, really, really insightful. So yeah, hopefully that's been a really helpful snapshot of kind of what we're seeing, why, some inspiration to help you think about adopting it yourself. But as always, we thought we'd kind of leave you with 3 key takeaways, potential routes in, ways that you could maybe adopt some of this theory or some of these attributes that we've seen help you if you're trying to become more relevant with Gen Z. So first up, considering adopting that adorkable aesthetic, leaning into some of the core visual traits which we've seen time and time again throughout these examples from great adorkable brands, big and small. And a brand that we've been working with and experimenting with this notion is Citizen M, hotel brand, not an adorkable brand or Gen Z brand by nature, but certainly one I think will appeal to them in due course because of the way they do business, because of how their brand acts. So we've applied this thinking, we've been experimenting with nostalgic sort of dreamcore Y2K art direction aesthetic. You can see on the left, layering that across brand assets to make them feel more relevant. Applied it by integrating kind of key trends like satisfaction, ASMR, in some of these hotel room reviews and tours and guides to make them again feel more relevant and suited to social, or even building in culturally relevant trends and design cues from TikTok and using that to help promote destinations or promote exploration in a way that feels authentic. There are lots of ways to harness that visual chaos to help you create some credibility. Point number two, secondly, looking at thinking about adopting some of those adorkable antics and tactics, leaning into the trends and mechanisms that speak directly to that generation's interests. And this has been something that's been a really core part of the work that we've been doing with Nando's over the last 3 odd years. They're integrating some of these antics to speak to that next generation of Nando's superfans. So whether that's looking at things like drop culture or merchandise and linking to fashion and music trends that are super relevant to Gen Z, or even integrating some of that self-deprecating tone of voice and satire to help us show some vulnerability in tough times, like in the middle, for example, like a chicken shortage. Or even on the right, building entire campaigns that are aimed to bridge that intergenerational gap, like the Nando's campaign, speaking directly to Gen Z, giving them something to gift their elders, empower them to make decisions and own that narrative. And then finally, tip number 3, considering adopting adorkable credibility. So looking to use, partner, and I suppose most importantly, trust Gen Z creators to run the show for you to add that credibility. And building with creators and forging those partnerships has been a really fundamental part of the work, ongoing work that we've been doing with Veet. Something that feels, especially important when looking at a traditional brand and the brand playing in the self-care space. So, we've been partnering with really representative creators, allowing them to control and create really, diverse self-care stories, entrusting them to own that narrative and frame ultimately the product in a way that feels really true to them and really unique. So that is everything we have got for you this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Mary and Joe for their insight. I'm afraid we don't have time for a live Q&A this morning, but please do fire us any questions to shout@bornsocial.co.uk, or you can drop us a DM on Instagram if you prefer. We'll get back to as many of these comments as well in the follow-up. And as mentioned, we'll be sharing these slides, so you'll have all these key takeaways, all these references for you to have in your own time. But yeah, thank you again for everyone for tuning in, and have a good rest of the day.